Thank you and good morning. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Criminal Justice Committee in 2026. We have apologies this morning from the convener, Audrey Nicholl, MSP, and Katie Clark, MSP. Fulton McGregor will be joining us later on. He has another commitment in Parliament. Our first item of business, colleagues, is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We are agreed. Our next item of business is evidence on reflections on the budget proposed for 2026-2027 and the Scottish Spending Review. We will have 2 panels of witnesses this morning, and I refer members to papers 1 and 2. For the first panel this morning, I welcome Theresa Medhurst, Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service, and Heather Duncan, Interim Finance Director of the Scottish Prison Service. You are both very welcome. We have up to 90 minutes for this evidence session this morning, but notwithstanding that fact, I remind all colleagues and panellists to be as succinct and targeted as possible in questions and answers. Theresa Medhurst, would you like to make a short opening statement, please?
I would. Thank you very much, Deputy Convener and committee members. Thank you for inviting us back and providing us with an opportunity to help on the understanding and context of the 26-27 budget allocation impacts on our ability to meet our statutory obligations. As always, we are grateful for the support shown by Scottish Government with the potential budget allocation, but I must be clear that it does fall somewhat short of what we believe we need to deliver on the full range of our delivery agenda to support much needed improvements and ease some of the current pressures. Our ageing estate is in desperate need of upgrades and replacement, and whilst the continued capital investment for the 2 new prisons offers excellent new facilities to replace ageing buildings, it is still of great concern that the current pressures we face through prolonged excessive population that our existing estate continues to degrade and could result in catastrophic failure. In addition to the deepening unease caused by the infrastructure concerns, the demographics of our population continues to provide an equally worrying trend. Since 21-22, our long-term population daily average has risen just short of 800, and those has increased, by just short of 800, and those convicted of sex offences has increased just short of a staggering 900 additional individuals. So based on design capacity, since 21-22 we could fill an additional prison similar to the size of Edinburgh and Low Moss exclusively with long-termers and those convicted of sexual offences, and would still require additional spaces elsewhere. This trend also represents a prolonged and continued pressure on resources, such as access to rehabilitative programmes, psychology services, as well as NHS and social work resource. This has created a bottleneck in people accessing the support they need on their prisoner journey through no fault of their own. Along with our partners, SPS are committed to reducing future harm to our communities and supporting the rehabilitation of those in custody. Our staff are, however, struggling with the relentless pressure, particularly over the last 2 years, but they continue to focus on building those important relationships, delivering services and support on making improvements where we are able to do so. However, I am really clear that pressure must now ease. Budget alone is not sufficient, but would absolutely alleviate some of that pressure. So the budget allocation for 26-27 not meeting our requirements will potentially result in some form of degradation of our service delivery unless the funding gap is met in year. I would like to reiterate the point I made during my last appearance. Our reach does not only remain within our perimeter walls, but it extends much further, and as a public service we contribute to wider societal goals. With this level of impact, we need a budget allocation which is reflective of that, without which our efforts may be lessened or lost. We are continuing our ongoing dialogue with Scottish Government colleagues and with the Cabinet Secretary, who are all aware of the pressures and the potential impacts, and we will continue to work closely with them to address those concerns in the next financial year. I remain appreciative of their ongoing support. Thank you.
I'm very grateful. I was originally going to ask what your reaction was, but you've set that out to the budget, but you've set that out very clearly. However, it does put me in mind of something that you told this committee previously. What you told us last year was, if we are unsuccessful in our bid for funding, I will not have enough money to run the organisation next year. At some point, the funding will run out. I cannot see any area that we can cut back, particularly given the population pressures. End quote. Now, you are unsuccessful in the entire bid for your funding. So it begs the question, is this going to come to pass then?
So what I would say in response to your question, Mr Kerr, is that in this current financial year, so we received an uplift for this financial year of an additional 45 million in the budget allocation. However, in-year pressures resulted in an additional requirement for 22.5 million, which was allocated to us by Scottish Government. Out with the actual budget allocation on its own, there are additional cost pressures, which I would like to mention around, for example, the work on, potentially the work on further measures to reduce the population if that's passed through Parliament, and other work that we need to undertake to focus on the population pressures across the estate. There's also work that we're undertaking in relation to FAI recommendations and other infrastructure work that requires to be done in security measures. Now, all of that has the potential to come in at additional costs, so we are pulling together additional business cases for that at the moment. So in addition to the shortfall, there will be further money that we will require. If we are not successful in achieving either an additional in-year allocation or for those additional bids, then there will be degradation. Whether or not we run out of money will depend on how the spend and other pressures over the year. So things like inflationary pressure adds quite a significant amount to our budget allocation. That changes in year and can either increase or obviously decrease that pressure. So there are a number of variable factors that would need to be taken account of. But over the course of this financial year and previous financial years, we have ensured that we have kept very close to government and that they fully understand the impact and the implications. So my understanding is that will continue. But if there isn't further allocation, then that it is likely that we would run out of money at some point.
And you've said in there a couple of times that there would be that the financial situation could result in a degradation of service delivery. Can you tell me what you mean by degradation of service? But also as part of that, you said in your opening remarks that there's a risk of catastrophic failure, were the words you used. What does catastrophic failure look like, and what are the chances, given the budget that you see before you?
So there are, so as I said at the start, I really welcome the additional or the capital investment in the two new build prisons for Glasgow and Highland. However, that doesn't negate the rest of the ageing estate. So we have Dumfries, Greenock, Perth prison, for example, where there are failures at times, and some of those have occurred recently, where boilers can fail, the heating can fail, so different types of infrastructure failure. There are, I think it's 3 prisons at the moment where there are temporary boilers in place that we are having to pay for at significant cost until replacement boilers can be sourced and installed. So that kind of failure happens on a fairly regular basis. Now, I think our estate staff do a remarkable job, as do our operational staff, in working through the difficulties that are faced. But nevertheless, these things do impact and do have operational implications as well as cost implications on the service that's provided. In terms of degradation of service, it would be difficult for me to fully explain what that could look like. But, for example, if we don't have sufficient funding and we know and understand that the long-term population is increasing, those who are convicted of sex offences increasing, those populations require a lot of investment that comes from psychology, from case management. If we can't provide that resource, that support, that input, then people will stay in prison for longer. Equally, we're not providing the service, and therefore there are other implications as a consequence of that. The other thing, I suppose, from my perspective, would be that all of the time that this is happening, the pressure on staff because of the population in particular, if we can't increase capacity across the estate to alleviate where some of those pressures are, one of the steps and measures that I have taken is changed the construct of the operating day, which we called the regime and roster review. And there are now only 4 prisons that have yet to make those changes. And those were changes to concentrate the staff group during the working day to ensure that we were able to deliver those services far more consistently in a much more structured way, so that people didn't feel that they were not getting access to the support they required. We will have to better understand the implications as time goes on, whether or not that achieves or realises that ultimate aim, particularly given the continued inflow into prisons that we're experiencing at the moment. But there are limitations on what we can do with additional staff if we don't have the space and time to deal with people because of that overcrowding. So resource will alleviate some of that, but not necessarily all. But those prisons, I suppose, because of the change in demographics and the population types, are going to become more costly, because we will require that multidisciplinary working in a much more enhanced way for those more complex cases. And I'm not just talking about prison staff, social work, we're talking about NHS colleagues, as well as other community-based colleagues. All of that will come at an additional cost at a time when the numbers are obviously continuing to remain at significantly high levels.
I'm very grateful, I understand. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to stay with the resource funding question for the moment, just to put the figures on the record. In terms of resource funding, the 26-27 budget figure of £509.3 million appears to be around £12 million less than you were seeking when you provided your evidence to the committee during the pre-budget scrutiny. Can I ask, therefore, what you have said that there will be an impact on that reduction? What direct impact will it have on the prison population in terms of through care, rehab and things like that? Has that been thought through? How is it going to affect them?
So I'll ask Heather when I'm finished, Ms Mackay, to just confirm the figures, because we've got slightly different figures for those, and as you said, it's for public record. So we haven't fully worked that through as yet to ensure that we understand where those pressures are likely to appear. Some of my concerns would be around resourcing services and support. But it could equally be around safety and security, as well as reform. So in addition to the type of work that I've already talked about in terms of multidisciplinary case conferences, I know the committee took a lot of evidence on drugs in prisons recently, and I really welcome the report that you provided. So there are areas in relation to that we want to make improvements, such as in the introduction of body-worn cameras, which comes obviously at a cost. Now that's capital funding rather than revenue, but nevertheless that comes from the overall budget. And in addition to that, the introduction of in-cell technology would make such a difference in terms of providing a lot of those services. And our education contract that was awarded in 2024 is predicated on being able to provide some of those services through that digital avenue. So that there are ways and means that we can reduce the impact, but it does require further investment in order to allow us to do that. But I'll ask Heather to confirm that.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. In terms of the difference in our original request, it was 15.6 million is the figure that I have a note of. And as Ms Medhurst explained, the inflationary pressures alone are significantly more. So the pay award, for example, alone is just under 18 million pressure. So since that original request as well, because SPS followed the Agenda for Change model, that has an inflation protection element within it, which uplifted the starting position for our salary base for 26-27 by 0.15%.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. That's good. Ms Edwards, you said in your opening statement that I think you said budget alone wouldn't relieve the pressure, but it would alleviate it. So can you maybe expand on what you mean by that, if budget alone wouldn't do that?
Very simple. We don't have the capacity for the number of people in custody at the moment. Yeah. And therefore we need the population to reduce. The other thing is, because it's been 2 years now that we've been running at high population levels, the distribution of the population across the estate is causing problems, because we have got, the best language, but we've got silted up small cohorts of populations who need to be co-located on one site. We're not able to move them around, to co-locate them so they can get access to better support and services collectively, in order to ensure that they can do so safely. And that the types, I suppose, of people I'm talking about in custody are so those who require some degree of protection because of reasons where they've maybe been involved in drug debts, or they've got enemies within, or whatever, can be linked to serious organised crime, obviously. And obviously those convicted of sex offences need to be kept separate as well. So we have got, across the estate, people displaced all over the place. What we need to do is to rationalise that and have people co-located in areas where they can access support and services in a meaningful way. We're not able to do that redistribution because we don't have capacity, and it's only exacerbating the situation. And we have more people locked up for longer than I think is acceptable, because we're not able to do those things that we need to do. So we need the population to come down.
Thank you for clarifying. And just on that, you've talked about the demographic now and the population types and the way the way things are going. And I know this has come up before during evidence sessions to this committee, and it's been raised about, do you think that there is an argument, and there will be an increasing argument for older prisoners with long-term health problems being located in a different estate? In other words, where they had access to health care, and they were out of the mainstream prison because they needed specialist help. Is there still an argument in your mind for that?
I think we did discuss that at the last session, Ms Mackay, and I really welcomed your question then, as I do now. I mean, the age of the population is increasing, and the cases that are coming through with historic offences is going to continue for a number of years. So we know that. So it is a growing issue, and one that will not be going away anytime soon. The type of offences that we're talking about, and it's not solely because the social care needs actually exist across the population, not just related solely to the ageing population, but nevertheless, you know, the offence profile is such that many of them do not require, you know, the high security that we've got in our mainstream prisons, but nevertheless they still present a risk to the public and therefore should still be retained in some kind of secure facilities. That will be for some of those individuals, but not others. So I think there is the potential to look at different models that may include some licence conditions, but definitely the potential to look at different models and to make it, I suppose, more multidisciplinary in order to respond more effectively to the individual's needs.
And is that work that you see beginning to be discussed now with, you know, in the wider sense? Is that work that's, it's not, you're not just alone in saying it, it's been discussed throughout government, etc. And do you think it could happen?
So there is scoping work underway that we are involved in. As I said previously, we are not experts in social care, so it does require others to look at what is the potential and how could that be achieved. So early scoping is probably where we are at the moment.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Rona. Sharon Dowie.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you about additional in-year resource funding and if you anticipated there being a need for any in the rest of this financial year and or in 2026-27. I think for your previous answer it sounds as if you do think there will be a need for it. I don't know if you could maybe expand on that a wee bit further.
Thank you very much, Ms Dowie. So I did mention earlier that we will require additional funding in the next financial year. In this financial year, no, we did receive funding earlier in the financial year and definitely won't require any more. My concern, I suppose, going forward, both for this year and in future years, if the population remains at the same level, is that the ability to spend money is reduced because people don't have the time or capacity to do it, nor do we have the time or capacity to create space for regular maintenance work. So normally, for contractors to come in, you would clear an area, a number of cells, to allow them to do their work over the course of a day uninterrupted to get the maximum amount of time that you possibly can and make the contract viable. We're not able to clear, I don't have contingency space, so we're not able to do that. So there is that degradation and that pressure, and the ability to spend, as I say, is quite limited. In terms of next year, so there is the shortfall, as Heather indicated, of 15.6 million on the budget that we were allocated. There is a slight shortfall, I think it's just over 3.5 million on the capital budget. I would have to say I'm not concerned about the capital budget. We have sufficient funding in there, I think, that will definitely see us through the year. And partly my not being concerned is because I'm not sure, given the pressure on the estate, whether or not we'll be able to spend the maintenance and do some of the projects that we need to do, because I can't free up the space to do that. So the capital budget isn't concerning, it is still the resource or revenue budget. And so that 15.6 million shortfall from the allocation, but in addition to that, we are putting in additional business cases for additional funding in year for other work on population pressures, as well as responses to the FAI recommendations. And there is likely to be one on additional funding for social work as well.
So the additional business cases that you're progressing just now, will that take account of the 15.6 million, or how much?
No, that's in addition to the 15.6.
So that's in addition to,
yes.
So you're 15.6 million short on what you asked for.
Yes.
But you've also got additional business
yes.
cases that will be even more than that. So you would prefer to have your 15.6 million plus additional business cases as well. Okay.
I think if I could just come back in on that point, Ms Dewey. I did say at the start as well, though, the budget position does fluctuate in year. I wish it wasn't the case, but it does. And it is because of external pressures like inflation. So, you know, the position can flux and change, and that's why it's really positive that we monitor that very closely with Scottish Government over the course of the year, so they know and understand where we're likely to land at the end of the financial year.
Okay. When we were doing the substance misuse in prisons review, you had mentioned various technological developments it's undertaking, such as drone detection technology. So do you feel confident that the funding provided in the 26-27 budget will allow the SPS to continue to develop and use technology to combat illicit substance misuse? And if not, what more would you need to develop this?
I think the difficulty at the moment, Ms Dewey, is so the capital funding, as I said, is sufficient. So we would be able to continue with the projects that we have already allocated funding to, including the additional security measures that you refer to. I think the difficulty is, though, if there is a shortfall in the revenue budget, how then do we square that circle? And that's the work that we're still going through at the moment, and we'll have to have further discussions with Scottish Government on.
And I know when you gave us your evidence on the 19th of November, you also said on the remand population, there is also the larger remand population because of the different legal position that they are in, and given the current funding situation, we would require additional funding to enable us to provide services and supports to them in the same way as we do for short-termers or long-termers. So again, based on the budget allocation for 26-27, how will SPS deal with a large remand population? Does the budget allocated allow for increased funding for services and support to be provided or not?
So I suppose in relation to one element of it, I suppose, would be the introduction of in-cell technology will allow us to offer services to the whole of the prison population, which we obviously have some limitations on what we can do just now. Our buildings are finite, and therefore even having some additional resource because of the high population figures, if I have additional staff, as long as we have got facilities to provide additional capacity to put on service and support, then we'd be able to do that. But there will be limitations because of the population pressures on, even with that funding, what we would be able to provide. So as I said earlier, it's not, resource alone is not the panacea. It's also the population pressures and taking some of that down and allowing us then to focus the resource on the full population as opposed to the convicted population as it is at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Just one final question, right? And quite a lot of your responses, you've obviously mentioned the high population figures, capacity issues, trying to even get maintenance done because you don't have any capacity to move people out of cells. Rona Mackay also asked about the ageing population, and you said it was a growing issue and one that's not going to go away anytime soon. You've also said about the trend for sexual offences, increasing the number of long-term prisoners that you've got. See that the future capacity that we're putting in, have we actually planned enough? Do we need to have more? I know that there's some more capacity coming with the 2 new prisons that are being built, but given what you're seeing coming through just now and the increase in sexual offences having long-term prisoners, have we actually anticipated how much what the prison population is going to be in the future? And are you convinced that, or do you think that will be met?
It's a really good question, Ms Dewey. So at the moment, Justice Analytical Services and Scottish Government project the population figures on a 6 to 12 months basis. But those projections are really broad, and you know there can be a 1,000 to 1,500, you know, in terms of so it's really difficult to understand where the population is going to go. I think the other thing is that whilst we have, and Justice Analytical Services do incorporate the statistics that are provided from the Court Service and from the Crown, nevertheless, particularly at Christmas time, we saw a significant surge in population. So on the Saturdays after Christmas and New Year, there were custody-only courts that were run. We took in an additional 150 people over just those 2 weekends alone. And at the moment, we are seeing increases week on week of between about 40 and 50. Now, the normal trend post-Christmas is that there will be a slow, steady rise in the population levels. This isn't a slow, steady rise. This is so. The normal trends are not being experienced in the way that we would normally, and therefore it's very difficult to understand, I think, or predict where this is likely to go. But that's probably a question for Scottish Government rather than me. But at the moment, I'm very concerned about where I am seeing, you know, another 41 individuals in on Monday night. We are really, really struggling with the population flow in at the moment.
Thank you. I think it's definitely something the committee needs to look at a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Jamie Hepburn.
Convener, just some questions about your capital allocation. And you said some of their figures were slightly different in terms of the resource allocation when Rona Mackay was speaking with you. So I'm just going to check that we've got the right figures in front of me. So you sought £462 million for capital, is that right? And you've been allocated £458.5 million. So it's basically more or less what you asked for, just about 99 point something %. I think you said this to Shandau. I just want to make sure that the capture correctly. So you said that capital allocation is sufficient for the purposes for the year ahead. Does that cover everything then in terms of clearly got the 2 significant projects underway at Highland and at Glasgow, but you also spoke about the ageing estate. You mentioned Greenock specifically. You mentioned another prison. Forgive me, I can't remember which one you mentioned off the. Didn't write it down quickly enough. Which other one you mentioned? So across all of these priorities, the capital allocation will meet the requirements.
Thank you very much, Mr Hepburn. So we are just about £3.5 million short of what we asked for. The major infrastructure projects of Glasgow and Highland, we are satisfied there's sufficient in the budget to cover the costs for those in the next financial year. The main bulk of the cost for Glasgow will be next year and the following financial year. And obviously, Highland will be, the development of Highland will be concluded in the autumn. So the remainder of the capital is for our infrastructure projects, other infrastructure projects, and other additional work around reform and investment. So like drone detection technology, etc., then cell technology. So all of that, I am confident we would be able to meet within the existing allocation.
That's useful to hear, and you've kind of preempted part of my follow-up question in respect of Highland, because obviously in your annual report last year you did say you expected Highland to be completed this year, so you're still confident that we're on course to meet that? We
are still planning on the completion in the autumn of this year. There was some slippage from the contractor last year, but we have an independent programme analytical expert currently reviewing the revised programme to give us that confidence and assurance that we will still come in autumn of this year.
What caused the slippage? Is the usual weather and stuff like that?
Some of it was the precast concrete off-site. Okay. That was some of it. Some of it was down to other potential changes, but we're still working our way through the implications of that.
So it was more to do with the fabric structure of the building itself. Okay. And sort of same question for Glasgow. No, it's further down the line, but in your annual report you said late 2028 this allocation is sufficient. Again, you consider that timescale as still achievable?
I know that this is very early, obviously, in the life cycle of that contract. We still have a number of years to go, but at the moment the contract is progressing well, both in terms of cost and timescales. So there are no, I shouldn't say this, at the moment I don't have any concerns, but obviously a beast from the east, or who knows what.
I get that there are sometimes things that are out with control, but notwithstanding that, okay. You mentioned just in the other capital investment, you mentioned specifically in terms of drone technology, which was an area of interest. I only came in at the end of it, but in terms of drugs and prisons and inquiry, this might be one more for government associated with that. There had to be some interaction with the UK government around the laws impacts that. Is there any update on that, or would that be something we'd have to?
That is Scottish Government that are leading on that rather than ourselves, Mr Hepburn. Sorry, I don't have anything up to date on that.
One other question, if I may, it's not related to capital. It was my hobby horse when we were doing the budget session in advance of it being, the draft budget being published. I was asking about the impact of the increase in employer national insurance contributions. I'm sure you'll remember. Can you remind me if you were able to set out what it was for this year, and if you've got an assessment yet of the likely impact for the coming financial year 26-27?
Yeah, I'll hand you over to Heather. She's the figures person.
Thank you, Mr Hepburn. So we were awarded during this current year around £3.5 million, which was 60% of our direct staff element uplift. As you'll be aware, we were still required to find the remaining 40%, and that's rolled into this year. So it's increased slightly, but
I was looking for, so I could sit here and probably try and work out the 40-60% split, but do you have that off the top of your head as to what the impact, notwithstanding some of it being alleviated through an additional?
So it was around £5.5 million impact last year.
And do we know what it'll be next year? I mean, presumably it'll be broadly similar, but if there's increase to salaries,
there'll be a small uplift, but I expect it'll still be under 6 million, but I don't have the figure to hand.
Somewhere between 5.5 and 6. Okay. Thank you.
So I've got a couple of supplementals to Jamie Hepburn's line of questioning, first from Rona Mackay, and then I'll go to Pauline McNeill.
Right, thank you, Convener. Yes, so just to follow up on Jamie Hepburn's questions on the capital budget, I'm just wondering if you can say how that will impact the expansion of the women's custody units. Obviously we have 2, and I think 5 were originally scoped and planned. Is that going to be... Is there progress been made in that, or is our budget's going to affect that?
So, thank you, Ms Mackay, and you're absolutely right. The original scoping was for 5 community custody units. The initial 2 were intended to pilot the model to see whether or not this actually was going to be something that would work in Scotland. And obviously we had the recently published Sparrow report, the research into how they've developed. As yet there hasn't been discussion, and so there isn't any funding allocated for next financial year in relation to further community custody units.
And are you thinking, are you pessimistic about the expansion, or are you thinking that has it been put on ice, as it were, since the Sparrow report, or?
I think that I wouldn't say it's been put on ice. I think the women's estate does require more focus in terms of the complexity of the population, because particularly when we opened HMP Stirling and closed Cornton Vale, we saw a lot of women coming into custody who were middle-aged, who we hadn't seen in custody before, who came in with who were quite traumatised and were very vulnerable and high risk all at the same time. So there has been a shift in again, the population and the type of women that we're receiving in to custody. So I think there would require to be more scoping over the population that we have just now and what may best suit their needs, because certainly there are concerns about, you know, the highly vulnerable, highly high-risk women that do come in, unfortunately. And I have no explanation for why that happened when Stirling opened, but a lot of women that we had no contact with previously who came in for
really
the first time.
interesting, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Very grateful. Pauline McNeill.
Good morning. Firstly, just sticking with the capital budget implications, I was going to ask about Adwell, but that's not told. The contract's not going to be brought into 2033, so that's well beyond the spending review relief. Could I ask about HMP Kilmarnock? I know that transferred in March 24. Were there any post-March 24 implications of bringing that contract in-house?
So we did require to put in additional investment into Kilmarnock, and there have been additional operating costs since then, but that was all taken into account, the majority of it, in the 23, where are we now, we're 25, 26, 24, 25 budget. So that was all, and we have since obviously just absorbed those costs as part of our ongoing bids for funding going forward.
Thank you. It occurred to me when Jamie Hepburn was asking about the new prisons, and that was positive news that we're on track. What's happening with the old Barlinnie prison? Is that something that's an asset for the SPS? What's the status of the old prison?
So Barlinnie's still operating at full pelt. I can say that. So when we open Glasgow, the intention is that Barlinnie would close, and that then becomes an asset for Scottish Government. And Scottish Government are obviously then would be involved in the disposal of the site and the buildings.
Scottish Government asset eventually when it happens. Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about what looks to be a bleaker outlook, and that is the spending review funding for the years 27, 28, 28 and 29, which we understand is set to decline significantly compared to 26, 27. Is it your understanding that this reflects expected changes in planned capital spending? If so, would the proposed funding allow for the completion of the new prisons? But I think you've said that would. But I just wondered if you could tell the committee what the implications for the later years of the spending review would be for the service.
So on the capital side, obviously, Scottish Government are aware of the full costs of both contracts. Highland will be completed in the next financial year anyway, and Glasgow will be concluded in 2028. So my understanding at the moment would be that because we're in contract, those full costs will be met. I think where there are potential issues and difficulties would be around the additional capital for the just general infrastructure projects.
Mm-hmm. And what about the revenue implications for the later part of the spending review? Okay.
I suppose a lot of that depends, Ms McNeill, and that's a really good question, because a lot of that depends on what happens with the population. And at the moment, as I said earlier, you know, the population projections only take us a very short period into the future. There obviously was the Sentencing and Penal Commission report produced just last week, announced last week, and there are a number of recommendations in that. It will depend very much on, I suppose, the approach of the new Parliament once the election's over, and deciding how they want to deal with prison population, rather than me decide today.
Yeah, no, I've read some of it. I've not read all of the 149 pages, but I did note that they did say that compared to other countries, probably our prison population should ideally be around 5,500, which I understand is significantly less than the population that you're managing at the moment. So yes, let's see what becomes of that. I don't have any further questions, Convener.
Thank you. Just on that final point then, Theresa Medhurst, so what do you expect, because you will be planning ahead, notwithstanding the challenges that you're facing, so to take exactly that question, what do you expect the resource funding requirements of the SPS to be for the period covered by the spending review?
So I am going to assume that our costs will increase because of inflation, because of the public sector pay policy, and generally because of the continuing high population. But there are many factors within that that could affect and change the anticipated spend profile. You know, the introduction of in-cell technology could have significant implications once it's fully embedded for not just the SPS in terms of providing services to individuals, but also to our partner agencies, for example, criminal justice social work, our community-based and NHS services, etc. So there are a lot of services that could be delivered in quite a different way that would have an impact on resource profiles. And it's really difficult to anticipate what that would look like, particularly given the shifts in the population demographic that I referenced earlier, that shift in the long-term prisoner population, the lack of reduction in the remand population. If, you know, it would be good to know and understand what the implications of some of the decisions that are being taken by other parts of the justice sector, such as in policing, in the Crown and courts, will have in 2 and 3 years' time. But at the moment, we just don't have that. Thank you.
I have one further question. So if colleagues have anything else, then catch my eye as I'm after I've asked it. Theresa Medhurst, right at the start of this session, you talked about your staff and the officers that you have available and the pressures, considerable pressures, that they're operating under. Can you tell the committee what is the current trend in the turnover of your staff complement and your ability to recruit to the service? And is there any impact of the, call it £12 million shortfall in resource funding on your ability to look after them, and particularly around the mental health pressures?
It's a really interesting question again, Mr. Kerr. So I don't have with me the attrition rates, but I can write to the committee separately about that. What I do know is, certainly on operational staff, we are sitting at 0.6 below our complemented position, which is actually a pretty healthy position to be in overall. We are continuing to recruit, and obviously at the moment our focus is on the recruitment for Highland, because that will increase in size by almost double. So there are additional staffing resources required there. We are continuing to recruit and are constantly reviewing and updating our recruitment practices, but we are getting people into the organisation still in the numbers that we would want. I think where the pressure is being felt is around those that are in our sick absence figures, a lot of musculoskeletal and mental health problems. And, you know, part of that stems from a period during the 80s when there were changes within the organisation, and in the mid-90s as well, when there were significant recruitment campaigns at that time. So the staffing age profile, a lot of those staff are now coming to the end of their service, and we are seeing more people who have got health issues or conditions. So we're working our way through that. We are putting in place and have put in place some additional supports for staff, but there is definitely much more we can do. And we also need to provide training in a much different way as well. So there is further investment that is required. And once we are clearer about what that investment, the scale of that investment looks like, then obviously we will have to bid for that additional funding as well. Some of it we may be able to repurpose from the existing resource that we have, but probably not all of it.
So just to be clear, that the extra resource funding that you might need for that, that is not currently there. Because there's a £12 million, or as a part function of the £12 million shortfall in what you requested.
So we haven't bid specifically for any money on that front. What we have already provided some additional support for staff, and some additional support actually for our senior leaders as well, and we're managing that in budget at the moment. Should that increase or change, then obviously we would need to look at that. I think probably more it would be in relation to changes in the training, the profile of how we train staff and the type of training that we provide to them, that will require some additional resource, but we are still very early into our thinking on that front.
Yes, I understand. Rona Mackay would like to come back in.
Yes, thank you, Convener. It's on a different, it's not a supplementary, is that okay? It's just the sentencing review was published last week. Now, I'm not expecting you to, I'm not going to specifically ask you about that because it might be too soon for you to comment, and I understand that. But I was wanting to ask you if you thought, given the problems with the population, etc., you're in favour of more community alternatives to pathways and community justice, and should more money be put into that to alleviate the problems of the population in prison?
Thank you very much, Ms Mackay. So you walk around any of our prisons, you speak to our staff, you speak to our senior leaders, and they will tell you that there are people in prison who would be better served by community sentences and or alternative types of support. And certainly for me, that early prevention and early intervention, given that we have got one of the highest prison populations, certainly in Europe, and it is only increasing, is something that does need to be considered very seriously.
Thank you.
And Pauline McNeill, please.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot being said about the remand population, and it's referred to in the Sentencing Commission's report. It's just food for thought, really. I mean, there's not been much discussion, certainly in this committee, about the profile of the remand population. All we've really been able to really talk about is just how escalating it is, and we know many people who've been waiting far too long. In fact, the sentence that they would have been given is actually shorter than the remand, so we've got a problem here. Is there anything that you can tell the committee about the management of remand offenders? So you've talked about the prison population and the changing demographics. You've got more sex offenders, older prisoners, changing profile even amongst female prisoners. But we don't hear much about the profile of remand prisoners who are awaiting trial. Is there anything at all you can tell about any changing elements to that profile for locking up more people? Or
I think the demographic description that I provided around ageing, social care, vulnerabilities. It does all apply to the remand population as well. The difference is when people are on remand, obviously they're not yet convicted of anything, so they're still innocent. And they don't have the certainty over what's going to happen to them that somebody who's been convicted has, even if you're a long-term or, a long-term prisoner, you've still got a degree of certainty over when you're going to be released. So there is a degree of uncertainty that they have to live with, and they attract, because of that, different, so they can access a visit every single day. So there are different legislative conditions that apply to them than other prisoners. But it is quite, many of them will choose to remain on remand rather than bring their case forward because they prefer their time on remand. So that's one element. But the other thing as well is because they are still going to go through the court process, there is a myth that, if they engage in services, if they engage in support, that somehow that's going to count against them because they're admitting they've got a drug problem or that, so there is more work that we need to do with that remand population whilst they're in custody, and certainly more focused time. But when you were talking there, Ms McNeill, what was going through my head was, actually, what do we know about that remand population now, and whether or not it might be worthwhile just undertaking even a small piece of research just to better understand who's in there at the moment. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And Rona Mackay.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a bit of a random question, but it just came into my mind there. Is there an international example of what you consider to be good sort of penal institutions or prison regimes that you think, it would be lovely to emulate here in Scotland? And I'm thinking particularly on the impact that prison has on women and families.
I probably am not as in touch with this as I have been recently, but certainly the exemplars we normally look to are the Scandinavian countries. They tend to be where we would seek out good practice, although they have sought us out on some areas recently in relation to both the women's estate and in relation to our approach to new approach to control and restraint. So we are now being seen as an exemplar for some elements, but obviously in terms of the overall custodial environment and the training of staff, etc., then it tends to be the Scandinavian countries where you would look.
And do you see that would be at all possible to emulate here? I mean, I know it would take money to do it, but is it something to the future that you could look at?
If I can be a bit controversial, I don't think it's just about money. It's about, I suppose, what the public and Parliament is seeking to achieve, what they want from prisons and from justice in Scotland. So I think it's that wider political and public debate that needs to be had to better understand what you're seeking to achieve as a country.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
I'm very grateful, and if there are no further questions, then it just remains for me to thank both Teresa and Heather very much for your evidence this morning. We will now have a short suspension before we move on to the next panel. Thank you very much. Thank you and welcome back to the Criminal Justice Committee. For our second panel, I'd like to welcome Malcolm Graham, the Chief Executive of the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, Stephen McGowan, the Legal Director of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and Marlene Anderson, the Director of Finance, Procurement and Estates, Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. Good morning and welcome to the committee. We have up to 75 minutes for this session, and I would like to start with some opening statements. So I'll start by inviting Malcolm Graham to make a short opening statement on behalf of the SCTS.
Good morning, Deputy Conveners and members of the committee. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come back and speak about the implications post-publication of the draft budget on the 13th of January. I won't repeat anything that I said in our previous session in terms of what SCTS had asked for. On the positive front, we were successful in the Scottish Government baselining the Recover, Renew and Transform funding, which SCTS had been receiving as a budget supplement for some time, and this will help us manage growing levels of business across both the solemn courts, tribunals and the workload of the Office of the Public Guardian. We were also successful in capital funding to the extent of nearly £19 million, which is what we had asked for. The balance of the uplift that we'd sought was required to meet costs in relation to pay, inflation and maintaining our essential built and digital estates. However, there is an £11 million shortfall against our assessment of what we needed, and therefore a range of challenging decisions will need to be made to match available resource to priorities. Our final budget for 26-27 will be published as part of the SCTS business plan for the coming year towards the end of March. So the funding settlement will not allow us to grow operational capacity in order to match developing pressures. Indeed, given the projections within the spending review published alongside the budget, we will need to identify any further efficiencies that can be made. I'm very supportive of the approach set out in the Scottish Government's Public Service Reform Strategy, which calls for, amongst other things, digitisation and reconfiguration of services to deliver future recurring savings. But achieving such savings requires a degree of upfront investment, so we may need to direct some resource away from operational delivery in the coming year in order to prioritise any further efficiencies we can achieve to deliver such recurring savings, whilst the capacity to do so still exists. I'll leave it at that in terms of brief opening comments and very happy to answer questions.
I'm very grateful. May I now invite one of our Crown Office witnesses to make a short opening statement. Stephen McGowan.
Thank you, Deputy Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today. I want to begin by recognising the constructive engagement that we've had with Scottish Government throughout the budget process, and we appreciate the dialogue that we've had within our overall very constrained financial position. The draft budget that's been allocated to COPFS for next year will allow us to do the three things that we set out when we appeared before the committee in November, which is to maintain our resource to reduce the criminal case backlogs and support work to meet the normalisation of time bar requirements and to investigate COVID deaths. Secondly, it allows us to focus on reducing the age profile of our deaths investigations and support our larger and complex criminal investigations. And thirdly, it will allow us to transform and change as an organisation to meet the challenges going forward. Nevertheless, the budget remains tight and there's a residual gap between what we assess as a minimal funding level to sustain delivery in full, and we'll need to manage that carefully. In doing so, that we'll work on the basis that there will be ongoing discussion with the Government around any pressures as the year goes on. We will continue to focus on making best use of resources throughout the year, and we need to transform to meet the challenges in future. We're assessing the implications of the draft allocations that have been given for future years, which will help us in planning, and that's something that we welcome and we'd called for. But those demand and cost drivers aren't static. Case complexity continues to increase. There continue to be increases in the most serious crimes reported to us. And with the time bar mitigations falling away and the normalisation of time bars, we will have to look at the way we do that activity. We also must routinely absorb major incidents, and that will have an impact on how we plan for years going forward. So overall, we have a relatively fair settlement, but there are still pressures on our budget for the coming year, and we'll be happy to help with any questions that you may have this morning.
I'm very grateful. I will ask a couple of questions before I go to Pauline McNeill. These questions will go to Malcolm Graham for the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, and for complete transparency I remind colleagues that I am a practising solicitor and thus a user of the Tribunal Service occasionally. Malcolm Graham, you picked up something in your opening remarks that you'd also put in your written submission. You said the funding settlement will not allow us to grow operational capacity to match developing pressures, and you referenced the spending review and talked about any further efficiencies that have to be made. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell us what are those further efficiencies. Are there any efficiencies that realistically you can make, and if so, what's the impact of that?
Thanks very much. In terms of growing operational capacity, and I think I said this in the submission at the tail end of last year, as well as the short submission in advance of this session, we put in a budget request which was commensurate with the size of the organisation that we have, because we recognised that all the indications were there wasn't going to be room for growth. That said, there are significant operational pressures, which I've spoken about at some length in terms of solemn case business. Stephen McGowan has just referred to that as one of the priorities for the Crown, in relation to tribunals business growing, in relation to growth in Office of the Public Guardian. I think there is still room for efficiencies across the whole organisation, but it will only be achieved with the necessary level of investment for that to be supported through digital transformation, and thereafter the creation of capacity through restructuring or different ways of working within the organisation, or perhaps most importantly, across the whole of the justice and particularly the criminal justice system. And at the moment, the settlement doesn't allow us to maintain the size of our current operational workforce and capacity and make the necessary investment in transformation and change. That means that we, and that means the SCTS board, will have to make a choice about the extent to which operational capacity is perhaps limited in some regards, to ensure that that necessary investment can still be maintained. And my final observation is that, as I hinted at in my opening remarks, it would appear this is the year for us to go hard at doing that in terms of the necessary investment, because the spending review indicates that we're likely to get less favourable settlements in the years ahead.
Thank you. You talked there of limiting operational capacity, but in your submission and in your opening remarks, you said quite clearly you will not be able to grow operational capacity. So what is not going? What is going to be? Had you got the funding settlement, you would have carried out some projects. What is not going to happen as a result of this funding settlement?
Well, we won't be able to put the level of additional staff into the Office of Public Guardian that we would need to meet the growing level of requests for powers of attorney and guardianship orders. So it's likely that some of the time delays that people are experiencing in that space will continue to grow. We won't be able to staff and support some of the tribunals that are growing at a rate that continues to accelerate in a way that would allow us to ensure that timescales of those tribunals being resolved and hearings being set is reducing rather than increasing. And in the criminal courts, we have a slightly more complex picture where we're in the middle of trying to look at where we can use capacity that's been gained through successes in the summary courts of dealing with business more efficiently and translate that into dealing with solemn business, particularly the High Court. But I have a concern with that work in progress that we might not be able to do that to the extent that's going to allow us to keep up with the predicted increase in cases coming into the High Court. As I say, that's just been heralded as a priority by the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service. Now, that's all in the operational space. We're having to balance that with the ambition that we have to become a more efficient an effective organisation through investment in digitisation and more productive ways of working will also potentially be limited because we haven't got the level of investment that we require at scale and pace to be able to do that digital transformation work that's going to free up capacity to become more efficient.
I'm very grateful, and certainly I know colleagues are going to ask about the digital investment shortly. But in the meantime, I'll take questions from Pauline McNeill, likely to be followed by Sharon Dowie.
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I wanted to ask Malcolm Graham, so you talked a bit about the limitations now placed upon you on the expanding the operational capacity of the court system due to the budget constraints. So there was a big commitment in the Victims and Witnesses Bill to creation of a sexual offences court. Can you speak to that as to whether that would result in the delay of the set-up, or because I know there are quite significant costs attached to that reorganisation? It would be helpful to know what your thoughts are on that.
I don't think that's moved on, as far as I'm aware, since we last discussed it. There will be significant costs attached to setting up the court. We're still involved in doing some preliminary work to look at what the National Sexual Offences Court would mean. I don't know that it's necessarily possible to comment on there being a delay because there isn't a timescale laid out for implementation of the court. And I think that's something that we'll need to come back to working with other justice partners in the Scottish Government in due course. It's not anticipated that that's going to be a feature during the course of this financial year.
So, in other words, we won't see the creation of a sexual offences court, at least in the next year? That's
not in the plans at the moment, no.
Yeah. How would that decision be taken? Is that a joint decision with partners, or...?
I think it will require a degree of engagement with the Scottish Government around about the funding. I'm sure there will be a degree of collaboration around about that, as well as individual organisations doing that themselves. And there'll be a requirement for there to be collaborative working to look at what the implications of the National Sexual Offences Court are. And that work hasn't commenced yet.
Okay, thank you. So obviously the committee have been had ongoing concerns, as I'm sure you have, about court delays, and we'll speak to Stephen McGowan about that. Obviously, it's a matter for the Crown as well. How do you see this panning out in terms of getting delays down, court delays down, and getting back into the time bar?
Well, it's a mixed picture, as I hinted at earlier. In relation to summary business, I think there's been huge successes. I think that's been as a result of work that's been led on a collaborative basis, a different way of managing cases through the summary courts. The volume of cases that are going to trial has reduced. Cases are resolving at an earlier stage, and cases that do go to trial across all parts of the country now, as summary case management has been rolled out, are being heard in shorter timescales than they have previously. The overall number of cases in the system has come down from a peak of 43,000 post-COVID to now being under 15,000. The vast majority of those cases are summary cases, so that's a good news story. In the solemn courts, there's a trajectory within the sheriff and jury courts for that to continue reducing. It hasn't recovered yet, but timescales in that particular area are in reasonable shape, I would say. The area of most concern is the High Court, where counting it by case numbers doesn't necessarily tell the story. For summary cases, you might be able to have 2 trials a day. The level of work from all the partners, including the courts and the judiciary, is far less. For a High Court case, you would work on the premise that it's going to take an average of a week or the greater part of a week. And therefore, each of those cases that's coming into the system is having a disproportionate effect in terms of delays. And at the moment, that's continuing to increase. We haven't yet stabilised High Court business post-COVID. It's continued to go up. Prior to COVID, there was less than 400 outstanding cases and we're now approaching 1,000 outstanding cases in the High Court. And with the projections from the Crown about their intentions in terms of indicting cases into the High Court, we don't currently have a system that's big enough to deal with that without time delays continuing to push out, which is why, as I said earlier, we're looking to try and grow the capacity of the High Court into next year to make sure that we can at least stabilise that position.
And how would you do that? Create other locations or?
Well, we will need to effectively a combination of identifying courtrooms and court space, which we will find within existing Sheriff Court. The High Court sits in multiple locations across Scotland. But the bigger challenge is actually finding the appropriately trained and competent staff to translate from Sheriff Court business into High Court business. And then, of course, there's a wider implication for the system in terms of the necessary number of judiciary, of Defence Counsel, and of course there will be implications for the Crown of that part of the system growing as well. And we're at the early stage of conversations about what's going to be possible for everybody to support the plans for us to grow the High Court in terms of capacity during the course of the year.
Thank you. Can I ask Stephen McGowan from the Crown's point of view? Obviously, it's huge pressure, and I know there's a determination to get back to the legal time bars that we've been out set for a long time. What would you want to say about the impact on trying to get those delays reduced?
So that's our priority over the course of this year. The challenge in doing that is, as much as anything, we're now running a dual system. So we've got the cases with the legacy time bars and we've got the cases with the new time bars. So over the course of the year, we'll have that legacy system, and there will be bulges of course, across the system in terms of indicting cases, and that will translate into the court system. So there'll be a bulge this month in February of custody cases as they transfer into the new time bars, and that will come later on in the year in terms of the bail cases. That is a real priority. Malcolm Graham's referred to work to look at how we model this out in joint work, and we hope that some of the principles that we've learned in the work we did in the summary courts will apply, but we're conscious that not all of them will apply in the High Court, because the nature of the cases there is such that they don't lend themselves to as many pleas of guilty, given the volume of sexual offences, and we know from experience that those are cases which are more likely to go to trial. But there are things within the lessons that we've learned about agreement of evidence, about focusing trials on the key matters in dispute, and all of that will help go to that. But it is a tension across the system, and it is one of the pressure points that we'll face this year.
Are there any other blockages in the system about trying to get early pleas, for example? So obviously we've done quite considerable reform, preliminary trials in the High Court and so on, to try and get, as you say, agreed evidence in advance. My continued bugbear, which I have raised with the Lord Advocate, who seems to at least share some of this, is we talk to practitioners. Contacting the Crown Office and communication with victims is still really inadequate in many cases. So if you're waiting beyond the time bar, you want to know what's happening with your trial, or you want to agree evidence or something, do you feel the communication could be improved here, or is there some infrastructure?
Yeah, that goes without saying. We have a programme on at the moment, the Via Modernisation Programme. It's looking specifically at how we communicate with victims. We've had the Tanner review that was done on behalf of the Lord Advocate by Suzanne Tanner, and it has a whole series of recommendations about how we might do that better. So that's all work that we've got planned for this year to improve that. It goes without saying that the longer it takes for a case to go trial, that will have an effect upon a victim and a witness. It goes without saying, because that's hanging over them for longer. But we will be doing what we can to improve how we communicate with victims, learning the lessons from that. So, yes, there's much more we can do, and we've got a planned piece of, or two planned pieces of work round about that Via Modernisation Programme, which has been in train for a while, and the lessons that we've learned from the Suzanne Tanner review to put that in place.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Convener.
Very grateful. So we'll go to Sharon Dowie, followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you. Good morning. During the pre-budget scrutiny, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service explained that the requested uplift in resource funding would allow you to focus on two priorities: dealing with the consequences of the disruption to the courts following COVID-19 and making progress with and demonstrating the benefits of reform. I think you'd mentioned in your opening statement 3 rather than 2 there. Can you outline for us what improvements you hope to see during 2026 and 27?
Yes, of course. So our focus will be on the solemn level of business. So we'll be in the High Court. So we'll be looking at making sure that we are complying with the new time bars. But part of that is that we intend this year to look at a transformation programme. So we've restructured our business into different functional parts. And we are looking at the fundamental processes that we use to get the cases to court. So we've got a programme on at the moment which is looking at digitisation of some of that work, of beginning looking at the processes to ensure that when we do look at the digitisation of our case management systems, which are old and don't do everything that we need them to do at the moment, that we're digitising the right and the most efficient processes. So our big focus will be on that this year, to transform those processes that we use, because we have probably too many manual interventions and too much time where lawyers are doing some of the administrative work, some of which could be digitised and some of which could be done elsewhere. So when we do that, that will lead to a series of efficiencies and gains. And as part of our budget, or allocated provisional budget, we've accepted that there's £5.6 million of efficiency that we need to make within that. But we needed the funding on an invest to save basis to look at changing all of those processes that we've got underneath to make sure they're fit for the digitisation that will come.
I think you said in your opening statement as well you'd get a relatively fair settlement, but you still had pressures in the coming year. Just to double check the figures, it looks as if you've been given £1.1 million and £3.4 million more than you asked for resource and capital funding. Is that right?
So Marlene will correct me, but I think on resources we asked for 240.5 and we've got 137.6. Is that correct?
We've got 237.6 for the resource funding, of which we asked for 240.5. So we're 2.9 million short.
236.5. So you got less than you asked for.
We got less than we asked for. On capital, we got what we asked for.
You got what you asked for. Right, that's fine. A question on the pre-budget. So I asked COPS about the potential impact in the new legislation, such as the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform. They told the committee that it didn't include planning around the Act as part of its budget due to it being in the early stages. I was going to ask, have you been engaged in any specific conversations around the impact of the Act and other new legislation, either internally or externally, with the Scottish Government since the Scottish budget was published? And do you think your organisation will be able to cope with the impact on the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Scotland Act?
So my answer is similar to Malcolm Graham's. There is a piece of work that's yet to be done. There have been early conversations, but the implementation of that Act is, for us, an unfunded pressure. We know that to achieve what that Act sets out, and we have to bear in mind that the precise procedures of that court have still to be developed, and will all go to things that we have to cost and will have an impact, but that's an unfunded pressure in the future. I can't tell you how much that will cost. The early work that we did when the bill was passing said that it would be quite significant in terms of particularly the engagement with victims and improving the victim experience through the court. That's a resource-intensive an expensive thing to do, no matter how we do it. So I can't tell you how much that will cost because we've not really started that work yet.
Have you had any conversations at all with the government on it?
Very, very early stages, but nothing concrete in terms of timescales, etc. No.
So nothing as yet. Okay, right, thank you.
I'll think about it. Very grateful. Sharon Dowie. We'll go to Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you. Can we have a question about capital allocation and the very helpful written submission from the Scottish Courts Tribunal Service? You set out that your request was met in full, and we've just heard from Marlene Anderson there that the request from Crown Office Property Fiscal Service, I think you said you got what you asked for. So that's obviously positive news for both organisations. So I suppose it begets the question, how will this capital funding be utilised?
Yep. The capital is broadly split across two areas for SCTS. We host large parts of the justice system in our buildings. A lot of those buildings were, for reasons I'll not go into, built within about a 20 or 30-year period at the end of the 19th century and require a huge level of investment just to keep them wind and watertight, never mind the improvements we would like to make to improve the service that we provide to users across the courts and the tribunal system. Particularly, the other part of the capital, and it is roughly split 50-50, goes into maintaining and improving the digital capacity in the state across the country. Similarly to the built estate, SCTS is responsible for hosting a wide variety of justice users. We've invested a huge amount in Wi-Fi technology and other technology that people beyond SCTS can use in courts. It's now essential to the running of cases and daily business that people in courts can access Wi-Fi technology for things like digital evidence sharing capability and, for instance, the way that summary case management runs. So we're continually improving that, and that's really where the, broadly speaking, half and half of our capital will be spent during the year. Just a final point I would make in the capital. We limited that ask to some extent because we have experience that tells us you need a certain amount of revenue to be able to spend the capital. And I've been concerned last year and this year that we have struggled to prioritise the revenue that we need to make sure that capital is all spent. That means that there is still, because of the shortfall in the revenue that I highlighted earlier, there is still some outstanding work that we would be able to do with additional capital funding on both digital and estate work. But we judged that we wouldn't be able to support its achievement because we wouldn't have the necessary revenue to be able to ensure that the capital was spent within the annualised cycle.
I'm sure as a former student of history, I'd be very interested to know why all these court buildings were built at such a short period of time in the 19th century, but that can be a conversation for another time, perhaps. Just on the point you've made there, can you explain that a bit further? So you need a certain amount of resource allocation in order to be able to spend the capital allocation. Could you just spell out what that means more precisely?
Yep, you need in some cases on buildings, we need revenue to be able to get survey work done, to be able to get architects in, to get other contractors into place, to be able to plan for and secure the work. Doing that in an annualised cycle of uncertain funding settlements has proved to be challenging. And on the digital side, whilst we've moved to a model where we're increasingly trying to use permanent workers for a number of good reasons, we are reliant to some extent on a contracted workforce, and that all comes out of revenue expenditure. So if you can't match the scale that you need in terms of the people and any elements you need to outsource, then the capital money won't be spent in the year that you've got. And I wouldn't see it as a success if I was to ask for a level of capital that I couldn't spend in the year.
Indeed, I understand that point. This is now taking me down a line of question that I hadn't necessarily expected. But in terms of, for example, the point you've just made around the reliance on contractors, what drives that? Is it an inability to recruit just because of a shortage of qualified personnel?
In part, it can be within the kind of public service employment framework that we're not necessarily competitive in the market for certain specific skills. On the digital side, on the estate side, and the digital to an extent, you wouldn't seek to build functionality for things that requires a high degree of expertise and that you only need on a time-limited basis. Obviously, we're not in a position to have specialist architects, specialists in mechanical engineering, structural, etc.
The digital side, then I think we'd understand the.
Understood.
No, there's not going to be in-house architects. That would be an interesting concept for you as an organisation. Just going back to the wider opening question, then in terms of the overall capital allocation, having said you got what you asked for, so what does that mean for the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service?
You okay for me? So, on the same basis as Malcolm Graham has said, we asked for what we could do. We ensured that it is a fairly modest budget that we asked for, but it is based on the level of activity and delivery that we can reasonably achieve in the single year, considering that our capital budgets cannot be carried forward over multiple years. On the digital side, we are looking at our casework systems, modernising those through various applications, and to ensure that we're using digital technology to the best advantage for our casework. Our ultimate aim through summary case management was to shorten the journey time of cases, and that relies heavily on digital capability. We've been engaged in the DESK programme led by Scottish Government to ensure that the digital evidence sharing capability is maximised, but we also have complementary systems to that for the Defence Agent Service and for Witness Gateway, which we are rolling out and ensuring that people can make the most of their time using digital means rather than coming to the office in person if a witness is engaging with our staff. Especially nowadays, a lot of the public are used to engaging through digital means as opposed to in person, so we need to capitalise on that. On the estate side, we have 8 owned buildings and we have 8 leased buildings, and through the Scottish, the SSE programme, the Single Scottish Estate programme, we are to limit the amount of private sector leases that we have. So we have a multi-year plan on exiting private leases and ensuring that we either move into public-owned buildings or into our own estate. So being able to do that takes time, and we can't do it all in the same year. So therefore, with our capital requests that we put in, we had a phased approach to that to ensure that we minimise our estate footprint across Scotland.
Presumably some of that phasing is also to do with how long your leases last. Is there any estimate of when that process is likely to be complete?
We're looking at 5 years, so 2030 we aim to have moved all of our private leases, bar one, into either owned estate or shared accommodation with other public sector bodies.
It's a fairly short time frame, then. That should be.
Yes, it is. It's ambitious, but there are, when I say only 8, we have been planning before now in prior years to move to this state that we're at, and in order to take that forward fairly quickly.
Okay. Just turning, and this actually touches on quite a lot of what you've said around investment in digital capacity. And it kind of picks up on your written note, Malcolm, in terms of public service reform strategy. And you talk about that calling for digitisation and reconfiguration of services. I just wonder, because you've talked, I don't know how much of a separate conversation this is when you're talking about the casework systems. On how much potential is there for shared capacity maybe also including Police Scotland in terms of, they're gathering evidence that then goes to the Crown, and then it has to be presented to the court if a prosecution's going forward. So is there scope, maybe it is happening, is there a sort of shared system, is that happening just now?
Well, happy to kick off on that one. I think there's good evidence of collaboration to achieve shared systems already there, in part. But it's not at the level that you're talking about in terms of the core of the system. So things like digital evidence sharing capability across the key criminal justice partners. And there's a number of other pieces of work in progress which are aiming to be collaborative in nature, and which will look at a user perspective, improving things for victims, and have all the agencies involved. SCTS was successful in bidding into the Spend to Save fund that the Scottish Government made available last year. I've been making inquiries about what's likely to happen with that for the year ahead, and that's not yet been confirmed. We've commenced an entire overhaul of the jury process, which will be more user-orientated, digitally enabled and efficient, and I would hope to be able to bid into that pot to get money, which otherwise we won't be able to complete that work because it's not part of our current allocation. But I think there's a significant gap at the moment in terms of there being certainly criminal justice system-wide vision and articulation of what the future could look like that could be supported by considerable investment in digitisation. We've seen it in other jurisdictions to very positive effect, but I think we're in the early foothills. And I think, to be candid, we're some way behind where we could be, but we are where we are. And I'm now leading, as the Senior Responsible Officer on behalf of the Criminal Justice Partners, a programme to look at criminal justice digital reform. And during the course of this year, with some limited investment and support from partners in the Scottish Government, we will build a case that I think then presents what the scale of the challenge over the longer term needs to be, and really getting about this issue. I don't think, just to make a final point, we're necessarily aiming towards a single case or the notion of a single system. I mentioned in my report the Scottish Government data centre and some issues that have arisen there. SCTS runs 134 separate ICT applications out of that data centre. I'm sure the Crown Office Procurator's Fiscal Service has multiple systems, but there needs to be a plan that brings forward the notion of a platform that allows us all to integrate and that brings the ability to de-risk some of the significant cyber and security and safety risks, data protection risks we're all carrying with the old systems, but also brings in greater efficiency, integration of processes redesigned in advance of the digitisation, as Stephen McGowan mentioned, but also focusing on the data and the insight that we can get from a system that's designed to be integrated. It doesn't necessarily mean that one case management system is going to be the answer for everybody, given all the different needs that the organisations had. So, I hope in a year's time we'll be in a really strong position to say, here is the case as to what this programme looks like, and here's how much it's going to cost. And the cost of it is going to be exceptional to any of the funding that organisations currently have.
To the Scottish Government?
Yes. Who's
making that case? Is it a shared endeavour? So there is actually work underway? Yes. As I say,
I have stepped forward and agreed to lead that work on behalf of the Criminal Justice Board and the partners, but I do it as no more than a first amongst equals, and we'll do it with the consent and the collective agreement of the people that sit around the Criminal Justice Board table.
You haven't made yourself a man on the spot, though, so that's we know where it comes from.
Well, I go back to the point I made earlier. I think the gap is significant, and the progress and the opportunity is huge.
No, I think we can see it. It's useful to know that there is work underway, although our recognition it is still in its early phase. I don't know if there's anything to add. There's
not much to add. I mean, we're supportive of the work that Malcolm's doing, and I agree it's not going to be a supercomputer that does everything, because we all have our own individual needs. But fundamentally, how we transfer data around the system from police investigations to prosecutors to courts and then onwards to courts and criminal justice social workers, etc., all of which is an essential part of the system, is done at the moment in an ad hoc. And in terms of, I'm no IT expert, but I think the way we do it is still, in effect, there are emails that sit underneath the system, not emails that you would see on your own desktop, but that's fundamentally how we do it. And as a means of transferring data, that I'm told is antiquated, and there are many better and more secure ways of doing it. So we're fully supportive of that work. When I refer to the work that we're doing in our cases, we have our own systems that process our own cases, and some of them have been around for some time, and whilst they may be adequate to do what we're doing at the moment to meet those wider visions and to support things like DESC and such like, they're not going to be the platform that we can build on any further. So that's why we need to do that.
That might actually be in of itself an area of interest to the successor committee in terms of the work that's been taken forward across the justice portfolio. Just one final question, if I may, convener, and it doesn't relate to capital, and it goes back to the one I've not long asked the Scottish Prison Service, and I think I asked all of the organisations, in fact I know I asked of all the organisations in our initial evidence gathering sessions, just to get an update on the employer national insurance contributions. Obviously there would have been an increase in those, just to get a reminder, if possible. Not everyone was able to give this when I asked the question, but what that has been in terms of the increase this financial year, and if there's a forecast or an assessment of what it will be for the forthcoming financial year 26-27.
For the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, the pressure was 2.8 million. For
you say the pressure, does that factor in the allocation from the Scottish? Because it's the global cost I'm interested in, as much as I know everyone will come forward and say, oh, we've had this allocation, so that's the pressure on us, and I can totally understand why that's the organisational imperative. But in terms of the increased costs, generally, was it 2.8 or?
The increased cost of the additional employees' national insurance contributions was 2.8 million. The Scottish Government funded 60% of that, which was 1.7 million, leaving a residual of 1.1 million of pressure. So that was in the current financial year, 25-26. We have absorbed that, and it also forms part of the 5.6 million pressure in 26-27 that we have self-imposed to absorb. 2.8 original,
for this year,
1.7 funded.
Do you know roughly what it will be the coming year?
Because the 1.7 has been baselined, the additional pressure was 1.1 million, so it'll be 1.4 million after the pay increases.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. So it'll be 3.2 million additional cost, roughly. Yeah. Right, okay. And is there a similar figure for the?
There will be. I remember we wrote to you after you asked this question last time round. I don't have that in front of me. What I do know is that we requested an additional 1.2 million, which was the additional pressure going into 26-27. And as part of the resource settlement that I've referred to already, the Scottish Government said that 1.2 million is included within the uplift that they gave us. Now, to some extent, when you're 11.4 million short of what you asked for, it's a moot point. But I say the indication was that the 1.2 million, which was the additional unfunded pressure, is included in our baseline budget for next year.
Of course, there's a pressure that emerges from decisions made elsewhere, but I guess it would be useful just to, if you're able just to clarify a bit more of that in writing again, that would be helpful.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you, Jamie Hepburn. Before I go to Rona Mackay, I just want to check something, Marlene Anderson, that you said in response to Sharon Dowie earlier on. The Crown Office submission in November set out a resource ask for 236.5 million. I think I heard a slightly different figure for what was actually asked for. So just so I'm clear, what did the Crown Office actually ask for, and also what precisely have you been given for resource budget in the draft budget?
So going back, we asked that our initial ask was for 236 million, and that was before the additional pay award for 25-26, because the assumption was that we were sitting at 3% pay award, where it landed up at 4.5%. So the additional is the additional pay award, which takes us to the 240.5 million. The additional is also additional pressure that we had come through for post-mortems due to contract pricing increasing beyond what we anticipated. That's why we had to adjust our ask to Scottish Government. As you can appreciate, as time goes on, more information becomes available, and to put the most up-to-date position forward, we did that just after November.
And the figure that you've actually been offered in the budget for resource?
237.6 million is what we've been offered against a requirement of 240.5.
And that's very clear. Thank you. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to move on to the spending review 2026. I'll come to Malcolm Graham first, please. So just to put on record, when compared to the 2026-27 budget figures, the Scottish Spending Review proposes an additional 10.9 million of funding for the SCTS service in 27-28. However, as you have said, Mr Graham, funding for the following year would revert to the 2026-27 levels. And so I just wonder, is that additional funding that you got for this year earmarked for specific projects? I take it there'll be a lot of forward planning involved in this. And are the proposals for funding in 27-28 and 28-29 adequate?
Thank you. Well, the additional funding that we got this year largely only covers costs through inflationary increases, such as the pay increases that I've spoken about previously, increases in costs to things like building maintenance because of inflationary pressures, and the particular circumstances of SCTS, the additional costs through inflationary pressures of software, increases required in cyber safety and security because of our aged and degrading systems. There's a small amount left over for investment in reform or improvement activity, but it's not sufficient for the needs that I've already outlined in some detail. Now, when I came over a year ago, the request that we made to the Scottish Government fell some £8 million short of the allocation that we got for this year that we're in. Going ahead into next year, it's £11 million short. Well, the £8 million shortage that we had last year hasn't disappeared. It's compounded to some extent by what will now be an £11 million shortfall going into next year. The projection, and it's an indication clearly rather than an allocation in the spending review, of an additional 10 million into next year falls short of what we project we would need to cover the inflationary-based costs and the programmes that we're required to invest in for a sustainable future for our courts and tribunal system. And then the year beyond that sees a real terms reduction, which by any best predictions we would give, despite our desire to invest in further efficiency during the course of this year, is highly likely to require a significant cut in service if that was to materialise.
Any particular service, that would be in the front line for that? Can you prioritise that?
Well, at this stage, not really, I think, is the answer to that question. It will depend on where the pressures are emerging, the extent to which, as a demand-led system, we're able to respond to changing and growing demands across, say, the OPG, the tribunal system and all the different tribunals and some of the growth in there. And then, of course, the criminal courts, which I've described in some detail already, the differences across that. Where we'll be in 2 or 3 years' time, I think it's very difficult to say, but it's highly likely, with the level of cut that's indicated, that that would require us to make a choice about where we would have to limit operational service.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you. Can I come on to the Crown Office, please? Stephen McGowan. Spending review provides a reduction for the Crown Office service of resource funding, and I'm just wondering why and how are you going to do this through planned efficiency savings, and how can you do it without damaging services?
There are a couple of items in our budget going forward which are time limited, so that's part of it, and those relate to specific funding in relation to dealing with the implications of the time bar changes that we discussed, and also there's funding in there for our COVID deaths investigation team, which we hope that work will complete over the course of this year, or certainly most of it will complete over the course of this year. Part of what we're trying to do is the transformation piece, and to look at how we do that, so that's also activity that we hope to save from. Beyond that, it's difficult to say, and so the advantage that we have in having a figure is that we have an aiming point, and that allows us to do the work in the background to say, what can we do? But it's an important point to make that we are demand-led, and so some of the demands in relation to that more complex, serious crime area continue to rise, and the numbers of cases we're getting in that space, I think each month this year has hovers around record levels. So that shows no sign of disappearing. So it's work that's ongoing. What would the impact be? There would be an impact. I think in the context of the meeting in November, when we were talking about this year's budget, the Crown Agent and Yvette Greener set out some of the choices that we would have to make, and it would be about making sure that that work, which is time-barred or is subject to a time bar, is prioritised because of the timeliness that's required for that, and the service would have to decrease in other areas which aren't subject to that time bar, and that would be things like deaths work, which at the moment isn't subject to statutory time limit. So those would be the choices that we'd be faced with. But it's work. I can't tell you exactly what, because you'll understand that it's work that it's a moving feast, and it's work that we will have to plan for over the course of the year.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. If I could ask you just something else, and it's just something you said earlier. And it was in relation to the Victims and Witnesses Bill, and you said that victim communication would require intensive resources. This issue has been around since I joined the Justice Committee 10 years ago. It's been a real issue, victim communication. I wonder if you could maybe just explain about why and how it would be so resource intensive to communicate with victims.
So the whole concept round about this is trauma informed, and once you start getting involved in trauma informed, which is absolutely the right thing to do, you're looking at a situation which is much more bespoke to the individual victim involved. So you need to have more information about that victim, what that victim needs, how they want to be communicated with, what they need in terms of communications, what barriers there may be to that communication, and you need to know that on an individual basis. So that's what we aspire to do. But that
for people,
so
staff,
it's about training, but it's also the time that you spend on that. So our approach at the moment, there are various ways in which we do it, but some of it is it is less bespoke. Some of it involves looking at victims, determining what we know, and the work that we've done with victims groups of what they will want, and giving them that. That's not a trauma-informed way of doing it. A trauma-informed way of doing it would be to ask them, how is it you want to be communicated with? What are your needs? And to respond to those needs. So the pattern of communication with them may be different. It may be, for some people, be much more regular, and that cadence would be much more regular. For other people, it might be to have much less communication because they don't want to be reminded that this is hanging over them. But at the moment, I don't think we're in a place where we really do that, and we're not really set up to do that. Once you move into that space, which is absolutely the right thing to do, it's just more intensive, and you need to work more closely with the victims. There's a lot more work needs to be put into it. So
I completely understand what you're saying, and I'm fully supportive of trauma-informed interaction. Obviously, I'm thinking though that there will be a percentage of those victims that really all it takes is to say, you know, it's a basic piece of information or of a date or of a change or something that they wouldn't previously have been informed about. And at the very basic level, that has been lacking, we've heard as a committee. So is that something that you look to maybe address without going to the,
yes,
you know,
yes,
yeah, uh-huh.
Yes, I referred earlier to the two some pieces of work that we've got ongoing in relation to that. So there's the VIA review, which is looking at that in the round and looking at the service that we provide. We've got the recommendations from the Tanner review, which go towards that, and we've also done some other pieces of work. So the Victim Information Service that Marlene Anderson referred to earlier on is a digital platform. It's a way of victims coming into our system and getting that information on a self-service basis and updating things. So if all they need is the date, and they could do some of that themselves, or they can tell us that they want us to contact them to give us that. So all of that's work that's ongoing, and you know, we constantly... Absolutely, that responds to a need that victims told us that there was. So all of those improvements are that's ongoing pieces of work. But there's an ambition, obviously, to do much more than that.
Of course, okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Very grateful. And Fulton McGregor.
Convener, and good morning to the panel. Questions more for yourself, Malcolm Graham. You started to touch on it there in your response to Rona Mackay, and you may have mentioned it in an opening statement as well, but it certainly came across in your submission, and that's about the end-of-life case management systems and the work that is going to be needed to upgrade them. You're saying that it's going to need strong financial backing, is the quote that I've got here. So I'm wondering if you can expand on this a wee bit. What funding you think will be required, when this will be needed, and I guess implications if it doesn't happen?
Well, as I said earlier, I'm very happy to speak about this, but I don't have a huge amount of the detail of what the need in the future is going to be. What I've set up during the course of the last year, in conjunction with other kind of key leaders across the justice, particularly the criminal justice system, and I'm going to come back to other parts of the system in a minute, is the mechanism and some capacity to do that work that hasn't been done up until now. From an SCTS perspective, you know, we've had to respond because of past pressures to the areas that have been creating the highest risk. So we brought in a new civil case management system that's up and running, almost fully digital. We're starting to use different ways of interfacing with other parts of the civil justice system, including individual users and private law firms in an innovative way. And that's really good to see the efficiencies and the benefits from that coming through. We got some investment for the Office of the Public Guardian case management system. Again, it came on the back of some critical risks, and we're working through implementing that and seeking to get the benefits from that, set against some going pressures in that space. But the criminal justice systems across the individual agencies are largely in a state where, as has already been described by other panel members, we're using systems that were designed effectively in a different era for a different purpose. They're all roughly 20 years old. And I think it's important to note this isn't just about bringing in a new computer system. It's about looking at what do we conceive of the criminal justice system for the future, and how can that be supported and enabled by the use of technology and digitisation in a way that we've seen happening in other jurisdictions. The level of expenditure, as I said earlier, will be out with the current envelope that any organisation gets. There isn't any doubt about that. I think I mentioned in my submission the level of investment that's gone into HMCTS in England and Wales being over £1 billion in the course of the last 10 years. This is not a quick fix, but it's a journey that we need to get started on. And there are some good things that have been done, but they're not at the heart of developing that vision for the future. I'm hopeful from both ministerial and senior official conversations that the Scottish Government will get behind this and recognise both the importance and criticality, but also the opportunity that lies behind us doing this work, And as I said earlier, I would hope in a year's time to be in a position where that outline case can be made as to what this looks like over a number of years and what the likely level of investment is going to be required to achieve it.
What do you think if we don't do it, you know, if we don't start on that journey that you're talking about, what's the consequences of that?
Well, the consequences are across different fronts. On one level, and I speak from SCTS as maybe an issue I understand in other organisations, we're dealing with systems that are already beyond the end of their useful life. And that means that they present high levels of risk in terms of data security and the risk of cyber intrusion, low levels of interoperability in terms of being able to share data and access meaningful insights in terms of the system without large manual workarounds, and a level of inefficiency because of, as Stephen McGowan highlighted, sort of artificially constructed technological transfers that sometimes have kind of manual handling in the middle, or in the case of the criminal justice system, largely a paper-based system. Even where individual organisations are using technology, the crux of the system relies on things being printed out, signed in hand, and presented in courtrooms or other forums. And as we've seen from other jurisdictions, and indeed the legislation now enables it, post-COVID with the Criminal Justice Modernisation Bill having moved through, that the legislative framework will facilitate us to do a pile of things differently, whether it's looking at online courts, from digital submissions, digital transfer of documentation, through to an exploration of where it is and where it might not be appropriate to use online hearings for different parts of the system. And that will all be open to us in a way that at the moment is not.
Okay, thanks. Stephen, Marlon, do you have anything to add on this?
I mean, I think I'm in violent agreement with most of what Malcolm said here. Our systems are legacy systems. We've built all sorts of apps so we can do all sorts of clever things with them and keep them up to date, but we can't build any further capability on the basis of that, and that's why we need to replace them and refresh them. And we probably have a legislative framework at the moment that gives us more freedom to do things than we're actually able to do in terms of our technical capabilities as organisations.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah,
thank you. I've one final question, and I'll look out for colleagues coming back in. But Malcolm Graham, just on the point you've just been asked, you set out in an earlier submission and in response to Fulton McGregor just there that one of your biggest fears, and indeed one of the biggest risks, is a cyber attack. And you mentioned the data breach there. You told Jamie Hepburn earlier on that due to funding challenges, I think you said you run quite heavily on contractors in this area, which presumably introduces another element of risk. So what impact does a shortfall of £11 million, which I think you said compounds the £8 million from last year, and an ongoing shortfall in the spending review, make to your assessment of these risks? And what do you need to see, ideally, from the Scottish Government budget to mitigate this specifically? Because presumably this isn't a luxury, this is a necessity.
Well, the short answer to the latter part of your question is that we need the budget that we asked for, and the reason that we asked for that budget is because it was the minimum that was needed, and it was heavily contextualised in a recognition of the public service kind of fiscal constraints that the Scottish Government's operating under. So it wasn't excessive. There wasn't any degree of luxury built in. That was the necessity to kind of keep the system running. And I won't repeat what I've already said about what the consequences of the shortfall are. Specifically, in the earlier part of your question, around about what does this mean for instance, cyber safety and data security, that's an area I've had to prioritise. It's one of the few areas that we've spent more money on this year than we have in previous years. That's commensurate with an understanding of the risks. The risks are presented for two reasons. One, because of the change in global environment in terms of capability and intent around about the different the different threats that we face and keeping on top of that, but two, because legacy systems that are continuing effectively to degrade against modern standards present an increased risk and an increased cost to mitigate those risks, which eventually gets to a point where you're having to spend an excessive amount of money to shore up a series of risks, which ultimately should be superseded by new systems being implemented. And we can't do that with these legacy systems. They're not configurable any further to address some of these current day risks. On the contractor point, I don't think that is the case. As I say, we've limited our exposure to contractors during the course of this year. That was a deliberate programme, intentionally, to try to move towards a greater level of permanency in the ICT workforce. That's been successful. Not only has it meant greater stability and permanence for the individuals, it's also meant that we've saved some money, probably a slight temporary kind of shortfall in terms of skills development, getting people up to speed, but in the longer term that's the right thing to do. And I certainly don't have any evidence based on the checks and balances in place for employing contractors or contracting out work that would in any way increase the cyber safety or security risks as a result of those decisions.
I'm very grateful. Unless any colleagues have any further questions, I'll close this session and thank you all very much for your evidence this morning. That concludes our evidence taking, and I thank everyone for attending, and we'll now move into private session. Thank you very much.